My guest today is sleep expert Dr. Greg Potter. He is a recent addition to Food for the Brain's Scientific Advisory Board and helps individuals and organizations sustainably improve their health and performance. He's an expert in sleep, circadian rhythms, nutrition, and metabolism. And in this podcast, we're going to find out what sleep is all about and how to optimize your sleep for better health for both mind and body. So, Dr. Greg Potter, or may I call you Greg?
You may.
It's very good to have you on this podcast and very good to have you in the Food for the Brain Scientific Advisory Board. We are here to talk about sleep, but not just sleep, also the things that stop you getting to sleep, anxiety and stress. But I want to sort of kick off with really looking at why we sleep. I mean, all animals sleep. Why do we have to sleep? And what's it got to do with our brain and our body?
At a very high level, the way that I think about it was nicely summarized by a scientist named Till Roenneberg. And he said that we sleep to optimize the body for wakefulness, which is obvious, but actually, as we start to get into details, that makes some sense. And we could split it in terms of the brain and the rest of the body, or in terms of some of the different functions of sleep, bearing in mind that there are some shared functions between different bodily systems. One of these sets of functions is housekeeping. And really, sleep is an internal state, for example, hormonal state, that supports various processes like clearing wastes from certain systems. And we now know that the brain has its own immune system, named the glymphatic system, as in lymphatic system, as per the peripheral immune system. But glial cells are particularly important within the brain to the system, hence glymphatic or glial lymphatic. And it's during the deepest stage of sleep that that system becomes particularly active and helps clear away various wastes that have accumulated between brain cells as a result of metabolic activity. In terms of some of the other rest and repair processes that take place. Again, we can think about this in terms of different bodily systems. So if you take the example of the musculoskeletal system, then during the deepest stage of sleep, we produce much of our growth hormone. And that's particularly important to remodeling connective tissues, although it also has some metabolic roles. During sleep, there's a chance for the gastrointestinal system to take a break and to repair itself. We also see replenishment of various different energy stores in the brain and the rest of the body. So that's a little bit about housekeeping. But then I think another important function is that sleep helps us make sense of the world. It helps us understand recent experiences and put them in the context of previous experiences so that we can better anticipate what's likely to happen in the future and better interact with the world too. And so to that end, there are various changes that take place within the brain. For example, pruning away unnecessary connections that form during wakefulness in order to free space to learn new things, consolidating certain types of memories, but also integrating those memories with recent experiences. So, for example, taking autobiographical memories and then putting those alongside those recent experiences in order to try and come up with solutions to problems of daily life. And in that way, sleep seems to be really important to things like creativity, but also to how we interact with people. And there are various important roles of sleep in emotion regulation too. So I'll pause there. But clearly, sleep is important to all of the different bodily systems, and it helps us prepare ourselves for the day ahead, repair damage, save energy, and ultimately be better versions of ourselves. And so when we don't sleep well, all sorts of bad things tend to happen.
It reminds me just a bit of, of muscles. It's a bit like if you've got a dog and you take it for a walk and it exercises all those muscles, the next thing it does is to sleep. So in order to work and build muscle, you then need to have that stage of repair. Sounds like sleep at a physical level is a bit like that.
It is a little bit, and that actually brings up the energetics of sleep too, because sleep seems to be a somewhat use-dependent phenomenon. And what I mean by that is that as you do things, there are parts of your brain that are contributing to your doing those things. And that is energetically taxing locally. And so the more you engage in that activity, the more that you deplete those energy stores locally. And what you can see ultimately is that those parts of the brain that are driving that activity show sleep-like behavior. We used to think of sleep as being a relatively unitary state where it was assumed that pretty much the whole brain was in a similar state of sleep or wakefulness at the same time. But more recent evidence suggests that actually it's quite a heterogeneous state, and different brain regions can be in different sleep wake states concurrently. There was some lovely research by Gina Poe a few years ago that opportunistically took a group of patients with epilepsy and they had an indwelling electrode within a part of the brain, deep within the brain, and some surface electrodes measuring more superficial electrical brain activity. And they found that across the night, those two brain regions were in discordant states, so distinct states, about a third of the time. And sometimes they're in different sleep wake states for over 30 minutes at once. And so, actually, if we want to sleep well, it's important to use our brains, to tax them to do demanding activities. And that includes cognitive activities, but also physical activities. And by doing that, you're going to deplete some of those energy stores and ultimately promote deeper sleep. And this is probably part of the reason why exercise tends to somewhat deepen and extend sleep, provided that it's an appropriate dose of exercise. Whereas actually very high volumes of training, for instance, which can be hard to recover from, can temporarily fragment sleep. It's a classic sign of overreaching or overtraining athletes. Their sleep temporarily goes out the window and it tends to break up.
Now, that reminds me of three sort of bounced off ideas. One is I remember when dolphins appeared to have bigger brains than humans, there was a whole lot of research into that. And it turned out that sections, basically, they can't go to sleep because they would drown. But sections of their brain shut down. So, one part's asleep and the other part's awake, and then it
Yeah.
switches over. Did you ever look at that phenomena?
Yeah, so we refer to that as unihemispheric sleep. So they actually sleep with one half of the brain at once because they have to keep moving around and maintain some state of vigilance. And we see that between different cetaceans. So it's not just dolphins. Interestingly, and obviously we share a common ancestor with dolphins, we humans have a kind of vestige of that type of activity where if you're placed in a novel environment and asked to go to sleep within it. So imagine you're on the road and you're at a new hotel and you try and sleep there. Most people find the first night in a new environment, they don't sleep that well. They don't sleep that deeply. Their sleep isn't as restorative as normal. And actually, if you measure the two halves of the brain, then there seems to be something a bit like a low level of that type of unihemispheric sleep, where one half of the brain is in a slightly shallower state of sleep than the other, which presumably is to maintain a slightly higher state of vigilance because the brain is aware that in this novel context, there could be potential threats. And in a hotel room, that's very unlikely, but it makes sense in terms of our evolution.
Now, I was reading an amazing paper by the genius scientist, Professor Michael Crawford, who put omega-3 on the map and established back in the 70s that all brains are exceptionally high in the marine fat omega-3 DHA. I always used to think of the membrane of a brain cell as the thing through which the communication happened. But in his recent paper, at the age of 94, he's convinced he's solved the issue of how we see so accurately and so fast and in color. And the essence is there's this photons, energy hitting the eye, and it changes the shape of this DHA. He says from a horseshoe, docosahexaenoic acid, it's got six double bonds, uniquely able to convert photons, in other words, sun energy, into electricity. He says it changes the shape from a horseshoe into a chair. But the whole concept of this is that those molecules within our membranes they're changing shape. And that is actually, he proposes, how we see. It is the communication. But all of that, I'm thinking, has to be reset. It's almost like when you make energy, you get oxidation. And somehow that oxidation needs to be cleaned up. The brain has to be reset. So my thinking was that sleep must be doing that sort of resetting. So we're ready to receive the next day's worth of perceptions. Does that make sense?
I haven't read that specific paper, and so I'm not in a position to comment on it. It sounds like a very interesting hypothesis. I think the high level concept that sleep is important to resetting us for the next day in many ways is certainly consistent with the science. So can't comment on the specific paper.
Yeah. But
At
if
a high level, yes.
but if you take just the level of oxidation, is there more oxidation happening in the brain during a waking state that, in a sense, might need to be cleaned up? I've heard that melatonin, for example, is a very potent antioxidant, particularly in the brain.
Yeah, this is an interesting subject. So is there more oxidative stress during wakefulness? I would speculate that that is very likely the case because metabolic activity is going to be higher. And as a byproduct of that, you're going to do more damage because that comes along with the fire of metabolism. We're also exposed to various things as we interact with the world, various pathogens, for instance, be they from food or from other people, what have you, that can contribute to some of that type of stress. And then obviously it's the balance between the oxidative damage and the ability to repair that that determines the amount of damage that takes place. And that is where antioxidants come in, and they differ dramatically with respect to how effectively they accomplish that. I think there's a huge amount of confusion about antioxidants in general. I actually have my own podcast called Reason and Wellbeing. I just recently spoke with Professor Barry Halliwell, who's at the National University of Singapore, and he wrote the definitive textbook on free radicals and oxidative stress and antioxidants. And I was speaking with him, and he said that actually melatonin is not a good antioxidant at all, which I found interesting because if you read a lot of the literature on melatonin, people speak about it as an antioxidant, and they speak about how it can be so in different bodily compartments, which would make it distinct from many others. But actually, I think compared to some of the more potent antioxidants, and there are some really interesting dietary ones that go underappreciated. The one that I find particularly fascinating is ergothioneine, which Barry Halliwell does too, and that's what we were primarily speaking about. I don't think that melatonin is actually a very potent antioxidant. That's not to say that it wouldn't affect redox balance and the coordination of redox responses, because a unifying way of thinking about melatonin is that it is an internal signal of darkness. And this is part of the reason why using nocturnal organisms like C57 black 6 mice to study melatonin and then try and translate that research to humans is so misguided, because their melatonin level high when it's dark as well, but they're active at that time. And so in many ways, melatonin has opposite roles in their biology in terms of coordinating the sleep-wake cycle. But clearly across species, it is important to signaling the dark period. And for us, for that reason, it really helps ready the body for sleep. I don't think of it as being a sleep hormone. I think of it as being a way of coordinating that darkness signal throughout different tissues and telling those tissues to engage in nighttime appropriate activities. And so now what we're seeing is that melatonin supplementation can be helpful for various different indications. It used to be primarily used for circadian rhythm sleep wake disorders, such as delayed sleep phase syndrome or jet lag or shift work disorder and so on. But now there's this emerging body of evidence looking at some of its other roles, including in things like chronic metabolic diseases, showing some potential promise. And it does seem to reduce some markers of oxidative damage to certain biomolecules. But actually, if you assay it individually, then it doesn't seem to be a very potent antioxidant.
So one of its main functions you're proposing, it sort of draws the curtains on the brain, so everything that needs to happen in sleep can occur. Is it a bit like that?
Yeah, and it's not just the brain. So there are two receptors for melatonin, creatively named MT1 and MT2, and those are present throughout the body. So many different tissues, and it's only in the last couple of decades that some of those functions of melatonin in different tissues have started to be studied. And so, just as an example of this, if you expose the pancreas to high levels of melatonin, then because melatonin inhibits glucose stimulated insulin secretion, blood sugar tends to swing more. And interestingly, it seems that there are some variants of the gene that encodes the melatonin 2 receptor, the MTNR1B gene, that differentially affect the degree to which exogenous melatonin or melatonin supplementation has that effect. And so it could be that for people with that particular single nucleotide polymorphism in the gene, SNP, that contributes to that outcome. And that's actually quite a common SNP that has that effect. It's more important to finish eating well before you take melatonin if you're taking it to support healthy sleep at night. So it's an example of how actually understanding something about your genetics could have some practical implications with respect to when it's best to engage in certain lifestyle activities.
Now, that's a big rabbit hole, but I'd like to bounce back to you mentioned ergothioneine. Ergothioneine, I believe it's
Mm,
quite rich in certain mushrooms, porcinis, which we happen to have in our forest in Wales at this time of year. And it's being
mm,
touted as quite an important sort of anti-aging antioxidant. So you concur
mm.
with that. Do you think ergothioneine is a rather forgotten antioxidant?
Yeah, I think it was forgotten and then rediscovered, which interestingly parallels some of the other substances that we find in mushrooms, in particular things like psilocybin. It's the same way that there was a curtain drawn on research into psilocybin as a psychedelic for several decades. Ergothioneine was initially quite heavily studied and then fell by the wayside for a few decades. But then in the 80s or so, really spearheaded by Barry Halliwell, the research into ergothioneine was kickstarted once again. And there are various reasons that I think it's very important. Some of that has to do with just how the human body responds to it. For example, there seems to be a receptor for ergothioneine, which is practically specific for ergothioneine. It's the ergothioneine transporter. It's encoded by the OCTN1 gene, and it's expressed very widely on different types of cells in different tissues. And those tissues will very greedily take up ergothioneine, accumulate it, and the body wants to hold on to it. So one of the places where you find it, for instance, is in the kidney. And so actually it's reabsorbed in the kidney rather than being excreted into the urine because clearly the body really values it. So that type of retention suggests that the body really wants it to stay around. It also seems, based on the research done so far on human animals, that it has potent protective effects on many different bodily systems when they're exposed to various stressors, whether you're looking at the sperm, which are very obviously energetically active. And it could be that some of those tissues that turn over energy faster and in turn could be more prone to damage from oxidative stress are tissues that are going to benefit relatively more from ergothioneine. That's hypothetical, but stands to reason. Whether you're looking at lungs that get exposed to various different pollutants. So it could be based on the preclinical evidence that maybe ergothioneine is going to be helpful for people who smoke, for instance, and protecting their lungs against the damage that's done by some of those toxic exposures. And it seems to be really good for the brain. So Barry and his colleagues published some work that was somewhat scuppered by the COVID pandemic, where they gave people with cognitive impairment quite a high dose of ergothioneine for several months. And they found some positive effects on some biomarkers of dementia risk and some tentative evidence that there was some protective effects on cognition too. And I think that they're now repeating that study, hopefully without the same type of pandemic related issues going forward. But there's been some other work by another group suggesting some positive effects on cognition too. And then in terms of aging in general, it does seem that blood levels of ergothioneine typically fall off past a certain age. It's quite late in life, but that pattern is typically there in most populations. And there's evidence from other animals now that ergothioneine can extend lifespan. Barry and his colleagues have put it forward for inclusion in the interventions testing program, the ITP, which some people consider the gold standard way of testing the effects of candidate substances on lifespan. I'm not sure that I would necessarily concur with that, just bearing in mind the limitations of that type of research, but certainly it's very rigorously done. And because of the standardization between different substances, we can make apples for apples comparisons between whether you're looking at rapamycin or glycine or any of these other putative anti-aging interventions. So we'll have to wait and see what the effects of ergothioneine are there. But given the initial research suggesting that it can extend lifespan, those protective effects on different bodily systems, particularly when the body's under some sort of duress, and the fact that the body is actively holding on to it, as well as finally what is clearly an excellent safety profile, because as you mentioned, it's something that we consume in our diets anyway. And fungi are the richest sources. We don't have really good measurements across lots and lots of different types of fungi and different types of foods, but so far, fungi such as lion's mane seem to be particularly rich sources. So, given the fact that we're regularly consuming it in doses that are consistent with what you might use as a supplemental dose, and therefore the safety is very good, when you put all of that together, I think it is fascinating. And I think we're going to see a huge explosion of interest into ergothioneine, a bit like what we're seeing now with lithium and creatine. It's just that sometimes it takes a little bit of time for people to catch on.
So I'm in my late 60s. I want to have a super healthy brain and live healthy for as long as possible. Would you recommend I supplement it? And what sort of dose?
That's a good question. So I would recommend that you increase your mushroom intake
Mhm.
because other things in mushrooms, polysaccharides and so on, that do seem to be very good for you. And there's not that much research on isolated ergothioneine yet. The other issue with dietary supplements is quality control. And I do think that the industry has got better. I think that people sometimes over-egg the rates of contamination and that type of thing that are present in the industry. However, there have been studies within the last 5 years or so taking products such as melatonin and various different NAD precursors like nicotinamide mononucleotide off the shelves and then testing those products for what they actually contain and finding substantial discrepancies between what they claim they contain and what's actually in the products. So there are some brands that I feel comfortable recommending because when tested by third parties, they always seem to check out brands like Life Extension and Swanson. And some of those do make ergothioneine. And I don't personally think that there's any cause for concern if we think about the population at large, taking doses of, say, up to 10 milligrams of ergothioneine each day. In the European Food Safety Authority, is it, or agency, or European Food Standard Agency? I forget exactly what the acronym stands for, but EFSA,
Yeah.
the regulatory body, has deemed that synthetic ergothioneine intakes of up to about 30 milligrams per day for adults pose no safety concerns whatsoever. So 10 milligrams, which is comparable to what you would get from consuming substantial amounts of mushrooms on a regular basis, isn't a heroic dose. I think supplementing something like that would likely be fine, especially if you're someone that didn't like mushrooms. But if you enjoy mushrooms and you have access to them, then I would just say just boost your mushroom intake.
So coming back to the psychological side of sleep, I want to, we're talking about it sort of repair, regenerative physical processes. But there are two things. Ivan Tiddle came up with a theory about dreams, which I really like actually. But the essence of it was that as we go through the day, there may be charged moments where we don't fully express our feeling, be it one of anger or frustration or sadness or fear or whatever it is. And he says in dreams we kind of play out those unexpressed fears. We kind of release them in some way. So I just put that on one side. And then on the other, what I do, and I found it very effective, particularly when writing, for example, but really on any project, is I immerse myself in the issue, the problem, the concept, the drawings, the words, the science before I go to sleep. And then when I'm writing, I actually get up at 4 or 5 a.m. And I find a lot of things really fall into place. There's something about that sleep process that organizes and sometimes generates, new ideas. So the
Mm.
psychological side of sleep. You talk about that a bit.
Yeah, and I will preface my answer by saying that for people who are interested in this, there's a book that I think is excellent. It's called When Brains Dream by Robert Stickgold and Antonio Zadra. And in it, they speak about their model of why we dream, which they dubbed next step network exploration to understand possibilities. And the reason I mention it is that it's relevant to both the things that you discussed, but I also think that the model jives with the science. And there are various theories of dreaming that have been put forward that I don't think make much sense. And they include some of Freud's ideas, being honest. But going back to what you mentioned specifically, one of the things that you mentioned was releasing unexpressed fears. And I think that the stage of sleep in which we have our most vivid dreams, rapid eye movement sleep, which makes up a fifth to a quarter of healthy sleep, and tends to occur primarily late in the sleep period. So during the early sleep period, we have most of our deep sleep, but late in a night of sleep, we have most of our rapid eye movement or REM sleep. That stage of sleep seems to be very important to helping us process emotions and taking some of the emotional edge off recent events. And interestingly, if you take the instance of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, then one of the reasons why those people struggle to process the trauma that they've had is because they have very disrupted, fragmented REM sleep. And it's a bit like you need to play the record of REM sleep to the end in order to process events effectively. But when the record is playing for those people, there's a scratch in it. And as a result, they never manage to get to the end. They hit the same point in the track, and then they wake up out of the track. And actually, some of the medications that can be helpful for those people, like prazosin, seem to help by consolidating REM sleep. One of the reasons why this likely takes place is because during rapid eye movement sleep, the brain is in an interesting neurochemical state where levels of the stress hormone, neuromodulator, noradrenaline or norepinephrine are quite low. And so during that state, when the brain isn't in a stressed state, but it is replaying records of those recent stressful events, you can see how you could disentangle that type of feeling of stress from memories of the event. And that is probably part of what is going on there and why that state of sleep is so important to helping us process fears, difficult situations, difficult relationships with people, and so on. And so it's really important to try to consolidate that type of sleep and get plenty of it and do things that can help reduce distress before sleep in order to help us achieve resolution of those emotions. And then with respect to creativity, that anecdote is very consistent with many famous people of years gone by, some of the most brilliant creative geniuses, whether we're speaking about Einstein or others, people who have seemingly used naps in a way to facilitate creativity. And part of the reason for this, again, likely relates to rapid eye movement sleep, where in that state, the brain is generating sometimes quite distant autobiographical memories and replaying those scripts, but then also taking recently acquired information, recent experiences, and so on, and then putting those together in some sort of narrative because the different brain circuits in which those memories are stored are active at the same time. And then that seems to create this state that is particularly helpful to coming up with new ideas. And actually, there is some evidence that it's REM sleep in particular that helps people come up with solutions to problems that they previously found intractable. So while some other states of sleep might be very important to forming certain types of memories, declarative memories, memories of facts, and therefore, if you were trying to just give someone the right answer, let's say as part of an exam, it'd be really important to have plenty of that type of sleep. If you were in a situation where you were trying to come up with your best guess for something, but you didn't have all the details, actually REM sleep might be relatively more important. So basically, it's a long-winded way of saying that, yeah, I think there's plenty of evidence in support of both of those experiences that you've had. And I'd argue that the REM sleep is particularly consequential in that regard.
So, how much sleep do we need? And in a nutshell, what happens if you don't get enough?
How much sleep you need depends on many different factors. And I think we all understand this on some level. So one of those is just how old you are. In general, the amount of sleep that you need seems to dwindle across the lifespan. There is a question about whether once you get past a certain age, our sleep needs continue to fall, or whether actually we're just not as good at generating sleep, maybe because of some degeneration in some of the circuits that give rise to sleep. The amount of sleep that you need also depends on your biological sex. Females do, on average, sleep a tiny bit longer than males, but the difference is not very big. It's about 10 minutes. It also varies between people of the same age and biological sex, like most traits. And if you plot sleep need and sleep duration within people of the same age and sex across the population, then what you'd find is a bell-shaped distribution, as with most traits. So there are people who are legitimately genetically long sleepers and legitimately genetically short sleepers, but both of those groups are in small minorities. And then the amount that you need also varies depending on factors such as the season. So if you take people and you put them in natural settings, there was some lovely research by Ken Wright and his colleagues a few years ago. They did two separate experiments where they had people go camping in the Rocky Mountains and they had minimal access to electricity and hence artificial light. And they found that during the long nights of winter, people slept substantially longer and had much longer melatonin periods than during the shorter nights of summer. But obviously, in modern context with electric lighting and so on, that seasonal variation is probably much smaller than it used to be. And if you live by the equator, then it's practically absent regardless. But then other factors like how physically active you are, how cognitively demanding your life is will influence your sleep needs a little bit too. So if you take someone who's completely sedentary and you put them on a structured exercise training program that's appropriate for them, they will typically sleep slightly longer in response to that. Another exposure that will affect your sleep needs a bit is your pathogen load. So if you give people a modest dose of a pathogen like a virus, then they tend to sleep a little bit more. But if you expose them to a large dose of a virus, then sleep often really, really breaks up. And many of us experienced that during the COVID pandemic. So basically, your sleep needs do vary, and they vary between people, but also within a given individual. But there are standard guidelines that are put forward by the National Sleep Foundation that everyone tends to point to. So for most 18 to 64-year-old adults, they recommend 7 to 9 hours per night. For people age 65 plus, they say 7 to 8 hours per night. But if you look closer at their recommendations and the consensus statement, then there is a little bit of wiggle room on either side of that. So you could be someone who is a genetically short sleeper, and it could be that 5 hours is actually what you need each night. But I think many of us intuitively have a sense about the amount of sleep that we need. And maybe there are occasionally conditions where we can fully realize the amount of sleep that we do need. For example, when we go on holiday and we can unplug from work and sleep as long as we like and go to bed when we want and wake up when we want. And just on that subject, it does seem that most people do have some residual sleep debt. There have been some nice experiments on healthy young adults taking them and basically asking, how much can you sleep? Right now, you've got nothing to worry about. We're just going to see how much you can sleep. What you find is that initially, most people can sleep for longer than 10 hours per night. But after a week or so, their sleep consolidates at a predictable amount per night, which typically is slightly longer than what they were getting previously. Maybe that's no surprise whatsoever. And then coming to the second part of your question, all sorts of bad things happen when we don't sleep enough. And I could give many different examples of this, but in the case of the brain, you'll tend to struggle to pay attention to things. So the well-rested brain has a kind of reciprocal inhibition between networks that help you focus on tasks, like the frontoparietal attention network, and networks that are involved in things like mind wandering and rumination and thinking about yourself, the so-called default mode network. But what happens when you're not well rested, you haven't slept enough, is that that inhibition no longer takes place and you have these intrusions from the default mode network. And as a result, you find it much harder to focus on the task at hand. In terms of the brain, people tend to be more emotionally volatile, which probably relates in part to higher baseline levels of stress hormones. They also tend to engage in riskier behaviors. Some of that probably relates to changes in dopaminergic activity. You see a redistribution of dopamine receptors in the brain, and some of the ways that those changes take place probably leads people to engage in riskier behaviors, whether that's being more likely to gamble or whether that is just being a bit less healthy in general. You see that with food intake. People tend to favor smaller, sooner rewards, like choosing a delicious food. It could be a croissant, it could be a slice of cake, whatever have you, rather than a larger later reward, which in this instance might be, I'm going to forego that tasty food because actually my health is really important to me and I really want to shed some body fat and my blood pressure's been a bit high. And so I'm going to focus on eating these healthy foods instead. How you respond to the foods that you eat will also change a bit. So when people are short on sleep, they tend to struggle more to control their blood sugar, as one example. And then coming back to muscle, which you mentioned earlier, it does seem that if you take people and you put them on standardized weight loss diets, so you're controlling for their food intake, And on average, people will eat more when they are sleep deprived than when they're well rested, something to the tune of about 250 calories more each day. But if you give people food to eat and you have them eat that food, and in both conditions, they're eating less than their maintenance needs, so they will lose weight, then after a couple of weeks, both groups will have lost weight. But the group that has been sleep restricted, getting less sleep than they need, will lose more fat-free mass, which includes skeletal muscle mass, and less fat mass. So the composition of the weight loss is worse. And then I'll just mention one more example, which is the immune system. And within that, I'll give two examples. So one is that if you measure how much sleep someone gets around the time they get vaccinated, then their recent sleep influences the amount of antibodies they produce in response to the vaccination. So people who get less sleep have lower antibody titers, suggesting they're going to be less well protected against whatever they've been vaccinated against. And then consistent with that, there have been these wonderful experiments where people have been exposed to the common cold by physically inserting it into the nose to make sure that they are properly exposed and then tracking their sleep around the time of that exposure. And people who get shorter sleep are several times more likely to go on to actually develop a symptomatic cold than their peers who got more sleep. So just want to reinforce that it is affecting all the different body systems. But the flip side of all of that is that if you take someone with poor sleep and you improve their sleep, then you seem to be able to positively affect all body systems.
So let's focus on that because I'm sure most people listening are listening because they don't get enough sleep and are probably experiencing many of the adverse effects of that you've described. And you help people. Your clinical work is about helping people have a better life, be less anxious, be less stressed, and sleep better. So what are your top tips? What are the things that really help people to get enough sleep?
It very much depends on the person because the reality is that people struggle with sleep in very different ways. And there are different aspects of sleep that matter. One of the positive trends that's taken place in recent years is that people have increasingly focused on multidimensional sleep health. So once upon a time, people largely focused on the effects of insufficient sleep, say. But now we recognize that several dimensions of sleep health matter, including total sleep time, but also sleep timing, in particular, when you try and sleep relative to the timing of your body's clock, the quality of your sleep, and there are various metrics that you could consider, but one of those is just your subjective sleep quality or sleep satisfaction, how restorative you feel your sleep is. Another would be your sleep efficiency or the proportion of time that you're in bed, that you're actually asleep. And then also your waking function. So are you fatigued? Do you struggle to concentrate? Are you sleepy? And then finally, the regularity of all those other dimensions is a kind of meta dimension. So just bear that in mind. But the problems that I think are most common include three things that I'll point to. So one would be someone who just has lifestyle-driven insufficient sleep. These people typically sleep quite well. They fall asleep quite quickly and they don't wake particularly often or for very long periods. But 5 days out of seven, they wake to an alarm clock and they have that residual sleepiness that interferes maybe with getting going at the start of the day or their ability to concentrate. And for those people, they're going to benefit from some sort of sleep extension. And that basically entails spending a bit more time in bed and organizing your life around that, at least in the short term. It doesn't have to be a dramatic change, but some of the things that people might do would be to first set your alarm as late as possible. Second, keep your caffeine intake in check because caffeine, by antagonizing the receptors of a sleep promoting chemical that accumulates in your body and your brain during wakefulness, tends to reduce the depth and possibly slightly reduce the duration of sleep too. So while people vary a lot in how they metabolize caffeine, I'd say certainly finishing your caffeine intake at least 9 hours before sleep, but in this instance, at least 12 hours before sleep, and maybe keeping caffeine intake to no more than about 2 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight. So if you're 75 kilos, that'd be 150 milligrams of caffeine, which is about what you would get in a store-bought Americano or three small instant coffees or three small cups of tea, just to put it in context. And then also paying attention to your alcohol intake, bearing in mind that that can disrupt sleep substantially. We can come back to that if you like, but certainly finishing alcohol at least 3 hours before bed and no more than 2 units per day. But again, less is better. And then what will happen is that if someone sets their alarm later and sleeps in a little bit, there could be a tendency for their body clock to drift later. And so in this instance, I think getting outdoors in daylight and being physically active soon after waking is going to help anchor the timing of your body's clock early in the day, which can help you fall asleep slightly earlier too. And that is going to also help you extend your sleep opportunity. So being outdoors in daylight for at least half an hour within a couple of hours of waking is going to be helpful. And then going to bed slightly earlier than previously, probably no more than half an hour earlier, because otherwise you might just lie in bed awake, and you don't want to do that because that can contribute to sleep issues down the line if you do that too much. So instead, dimming your lights these 3 hours before you go to bed, your target bedtime, and then going to bed slightly earlier, provided that you're sleepy. All of those things are going to be helpful in that particular context. And also, I think for those people, the evidence does suggest that sleeping in a bit on the weekends is going to help. I wouldn't sleep in too much, coming back to the regularity point, but I would say if someone's very short on sleep, they could sleep in by 2 hours more. If someone is quite short on sleep, then 1 hour more seems more reasonable. Another common sleep issue is insomnia, which is still thought to be the most common sleep disorder. And there is a very particular way of diagnosing insomnia with specific criteria that need to be met. But if we're speaking about chronic insomnia, so difficulty falling and or staying asleep, or difficulty with just waking up much earlier than you would like to, and that's all despite giving yourself an adequate sleep opportunity, and also experiencing some sort of daytime dysfunction, like problems with your mood or concentration, feeling very fatigued or lots of pain, then for those people, many of them feel like they've tried everything and they've tried all of the sleep hygiene stuff that gets trotted out all the time, like sleeping in a cool, dark, quiet room and keeping your alcohol and your caffeine intake in check and being physically active and so on. My experience clinically, though, is that a lot of those people haven't actually tried the most potent behavioral interventions for insomnia. And cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which should be the frontline treatment for insomnia, is really effective for most people. Even when it's delivered as very generic online programs, it's very effective. And we can broadly split the therapies within it in three. So one would be cognitive therapies, one would be behavioral therapies, and one would be just relaxation exercises. The behavioral therapies tend to be the most potent in the short term, and they include something called stimulus control therapy. The idea being that our brains are very good at creating associations between things, and sometimes that works in our favor, but sometimes it works against us. So, in our favor, you're learning to drive, you approach a red light, you learn that you need to brake. And after a while, you do that automatically without thinking about it. That is a beneficial association. What happens in insomnia, though, is that as people spend more time awake in bed, they learn to associate being in bed with being awake and feeling frustrated at their inability to sleep. And then they can get something called conditioned arousal, where they can be really, really tired. But when they go to bed, suddenly they feel wide awake. And so fundamentally, what they need to do is spend less time awake in bed. And the way that they do that involves not napping during the day unless it's essential for safety. And there are instances when that is the case, like when you're driving or operating heavy machinery. But doing away with naps, if practical. Second would be only going to bed when you're actually sleepy, because otherwise you're going to lie in bed awake, and then you're strengthening that association between the bed and frustration that you can't sleep. Another would be if you're in bed intending to sleep and you don't fall asleep within 15 minutes or so, just go by your sense of time passing. Don't watch the clock. You should never watch the clock. Then get out of bed and do something relaxing, ideally in a different room, and only return to bed when you're actually sleepy. And then repeat that as many times as necessary during the night. And then finally, set an alarm for when you wake in the morning. Keep that at exactly the same time each day of the week. If you're awake a bit before the alarm sometimes, then you might just get out of bed and go ahead with your day. But the idea is you never sleep past that point because by having that alarm, you're ensuring that you build plenty of pressure to sleep, which accumulates during wakefulness so that when you do try and sleep, you fall asleep quickly and stay asleep. But also, the alarm clock gates your exposure to various things that influence the timing of your body's clock, like physical activity and light and food intake. So that's stimulus control therapy. Another parallel with sleep extension is that it's really important to actually match your time in bed to your sleep capacity. And so a lot of people with insomnia find that if they keep a sleep diary, they might be spending a lot of time in bed. Let's say, for ease of calculation, they're spending 10 hours in bed each night, but they're not getting that much sleep. Maybe they're getting 6 hours of sleep. So their sleep is 60% efficient. And what they would do during bedtime restriction therapy, which is typically done in a supervised way, would be to delay when they go to bed and then to take the amount of time that they're actually sleeping based on the sleep diary, add half an hour to that because nobody is just asleep when they're in bed. It takes everyone a little bit of time to fall asleep and everyone wakes up at night. So add half an hour to their actual sleep duration. And then that is their time in bed. So someone's getting 6 hours of sleep and we add half an hour to that, then that's 6.5 hours in bed. And they would do that by going to bed 3.5 hours later than previously, because previously they had 10 hours in bed. And then they would keep tracking their sleep. And if their sleep efficiency is 85% or higher for the week, then they would move their bedtime forward by about 15 minutes. So let's say previously, or when they first started, their bedtime was 12:30, so shortly after midnight. Then if their sleep is efficient enough after the first week, their new bedtime would be 12:15, so 15 minutes earlier than previously. And they would keep doing that as necessary until their sleep quality remains high, but they're now sleeping longer than they were previously. So those are the two key behavioral interventions. And I won't go into the others just because of time. And then finally, the third that I mention is undiagnosed sleep-related breathing disorders. So within that, you have things like primary snoring, but sleep apnea, and the most common flavor of that is obstructive sleep apnea, which most people have heard of, but still goes widely undiagnosed. And a lot of people were really sleepy during the day and they wake up with a dry mouth. Maybe they wake up with a headache too. And they don't know what's causing those issues. And so much of the time, it is because they're having these events at night where they temporarily stop breathing. So these are called apneas, or their airflow is massively restricted. And those are called hypopneas. So obstructive sleep apnea is diagnosed based on apneas and hypopneas per hour, or the apnea hypopnea index. And what I would say is if you are very sleepy, you wake up with a dry mouth and maybe you're a bit heavier than you would like to be, you have some of those risk factors. Maybe you're just curious about this, you never thought about it. There are various validated questionnaires that can be used to help identify your likely risk of this. And maybe the most helpful clinically is called the Stop Bang, STOPBANG. And there's a website, stopbang.ca, where you can go and you can click the link to the questionnaire, fill the questionnaire, and it will give you an idea of the likelihood that you have obstructive sleep apnea. And then if it does seem likely, you can get an at-home sleep apnea test done. If it turns out you have it and you start treating it, and there are various treatments available. So historically, some form of positive airway pressure, which is basically wearing a mask that delivers a stream of air to keep your airway open and stop those collapses of the upper airway during sleep, it's really effective. People feel so much better. A lot of people say it feels like I've had a brain transplant. I feel so much sharper. But because so much of obstructive sleep apnea is driven by body weight, if you think about your neck, the heavier your neck is, the bigger its mass, the more likely it is to collapse, especially when you're lying on your back. And so what we've seen is that over time, as obesity has become more and more prevalent, obstructive sleep apnea has too. And therefore, various weight loss interventions can by themselves actually cure obstructive sleep apnea. And we've seen that with bariatric surgery. But we're also seeing that with the new classes of obesity medications like tirzepatide or Manjaro, which I think has recently gained approval as an intervention for obstructive sleep apnea. So just look into whether you could have obstructive sleep apnea is if that is of any concern to you whatsoever, because if you do get it treated, then I think you'll find it really transformative.
And there are three interventions that I found very helpful with clients with a sort of nutritional therapist hat on. And the first two are more in that zone of calming down. One, which I found incredibly effective, is the music of a man called John Levine, called Silence of Peace. And although I haven't measured it myself, he has. And specifically, the function of this very calming music is to get your brain into alpha. I've actually never managed to get to the end of listening to this 40-minute piece without being asleep. So I'd love your comment on sort of whether that's true, getting into alpha, getting out of stress. And perhaps another approach in there, which may have a few variations, is I'm sure you're aware of, is the heart math
Mm.
technique. The essence of that is measuring a thing called your heart rate variability. It's not your pulse, but it's actually what happens between the pulses. They have a very nice app called Inner Balance and a device you clip on your ear, and it sort of measures your heart rate variability, but kind of your stress state, and various
Mm.
techniques, which are very heart centered, that help you get into a positive or sort of non stress state. And those two seem to help people to fall asleep. I'd like to ask you about something else, but maybe your comment on that would be good.
Sure. With respect to alpha, if we return to something that I mentioned earlier, I would just highlight that brain states are very heterogeneous. And so alpha is just a particular frequency band. So the number of brain waves that you see per second. I think alpha from memory is between 8 and 13 hertz. You see that type of activity a lot if people close their eyes, but they're awake and they're relaxed. However, I don't think the goal should be to get into alpha. And I don't think that somebody is necessarily just an alpha. Sounds pernickety, but I just wanted to be clear about that. I think the broader idea of doing things that you find relaxing before bed is something that is very helpful. And so going back to cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, relaxation exercises are a core part of that. And they can take various forms. And music is actually something that's been quite well studied. Music can be really helpful for insomnia. The literature is very clear regarding that. The data are quite consistent. If you have people listen to music they find relaxing once, twice a day consistently for maybe 15 minutes or so at a time, then people with insomnia do tend to sleep better. So I think finding music that you enjoy, that you find relaxing, and just having it on in the background in the last hour or so before bed is a really smart idea. There are other relaxation interventions that you could use. And so, taking the example of biofeedback, which could be based on heart rate variability or pulse rate variability, it could be based on EEG feedback, it could be based on galvanic skin response. There are all sorts of things that you could use for that type of biofeedback. The idea being that you've got some sort of sensor that's measuring a relevant outcome, and then it's having you modify your behavior in response to what it's reading from your body in order to get you into calmer state. That makes sense. And again, there's quite a lot of research showing that various forms of biofeedback can help support healthy sleep, in particular measures of sleep quality. But I don't think that people need any sort of fancy technology for that. And I'm a fan of low cost or free interventions. And so what I would say is that actually some really simple breathing exercises are really effective. It's not particularly clear whether using biofeedback on top of the breathing exercise alone is actually much better than just doing the breathing exercises. A lot of the work on these in recent years has come from a man named Sylvain Laborde, and his work's shown that if you have people breathe at about 6 cycles per minute, and typically with an exhalation that's slightly longer than an inhalation, so you might, for example, have 6.5 seconds to breathe out, and then 4.5 seconds to, have I got that right? 5.5 seconds to breathe out, 4.5 seconds to breathe in. So the total is 10 seconds, and then that's 6 cycles per minute. If you have people do that for certainly at least 5 minutes each day, but there seems to be something of a dose response relationship where more is a bit better. So maybe 10 minutes would be better than that. Then you do actually see increases in people's heart rate variability because of increased vagal nerve activity and therefore greater heart rate variability in lockstep with that. But you see some increases in measures of sleep quality too, and sometimes some improvements in mood, possibly some improvements in lung function, maybe in some instances, some improvements in exercise performance too, but certainly an overall reduction in feelings of stress. So I think a good way to realize that is either just breathing in that way. And you could play music at the same time that you enjoy and just focus on your breathing. I would do this while lying down because lying down does actually increase parasympathetic activity, just the mere act of lying down by itself.
Mm.
You could also use an app to guide you if you want to use a specific protocol to see how you respond to it. There's a free app named Awesome Breathing, which I like because you can program the parameters. So you could set it to 4.5 second inhalation, 5.5 second exhalation for 10 minutes at a time and see how you get on with that. And do that while playing your Vaughan Williams or your Beethoven or whatever it is that you want to chill out to at this time. I think that's a really good starting point for a lot of people.
And then lastly, I just want to touch on supplements because some people supplement melatonin up to 10 milligrams, sometimes slow release, fast release combined. Others swear by GABA, which switches off adrenaline. Magnesium comes up a lot. Theanine also. We've obviously spoken about less caffeine and none afternoon and less alcohol. And some report good effects on with 5-HTP, a form of tryptophan. And I understand that's a precursor for both serotonin and melatonin. And I do remember looking at one study that gave this combination of GABA and 5-HTP and reported that it cut the time to fall asleep from 32 minutes to 19 minutes and extend sleep from 5 to almost 7 hours, which was quite considerable. So, yes, value of potential supplements for some people.
With supplements, I think there are a few really important considerations. So, one is someone's so-called sleep phenotype. So, does someone have short sleep or long sleep? Do they struggle to fall asleep at the start of the night? They struggle to sleep through the night? Is their body's clock set at a time that they want to move, and so on? Another is that supplements tend to interact with certain health conditions. So maybe, for example, you're interested in trying to slow the aging process. Well, there are some sleep supplements that can actually help with both. Another is what your nutrition is like in general. So if you take the example of magnesium, this actually really hasn't been studied well, in part because we don't have particularly good biomarkers of magnesium status. Urine collection is probably the best of the bunch, but it's not widely used. I think the effects of magnesium supplementation on sleep are probably going to interact with how magnesium sufficient someone is. So if their diet is very low in magnesium, their stores are low, then magnesium is more likely to positively affect their sleep. but the actual research on magnesium sleep is very mixed, to say the least. There has been a meta-analysis suggesting that it might help people fall asleep a bit faster, but the individual studies are all over the place. And then interactions with other supplements and medications. So a lot of people nowadays, they do take sleep promoting medications. And then just returning to what people's goals are in general. So, for example, maybe you're trying to improve your exercise performance, and there are maybe some products that can help with both sleep and the exercise performance. So, I'm not someone that recommends sleep supplements in generic ways at all. I always bear in mind some of those factors that I touched on, plus a few others too. In terms of some of the supplements that I think are helpful for quite a few people that have very good safety data on them and that have some potential for positive effects in general. If we start with magnesium, then I really don't think magnesium is a very good sleep supplement. However, I think magnesium is a great supplement. I think most people don't consume enough of it. And when people consume more of it, they see all sorts of benefits on different outcomes, including things like brain function, but also cardiovascular health, metabolic health, and so on. There's a huge amount of navel gazing when it comes to specific forms of magnesium. The reality is that the
And
huge
what
majority,
about the
sorry,
what about the others? We've got about 3 minutes left, and I really want to ask you about how people can access your clinical wisdom.
sure. Yeah. So the others, I think L-theanine is very interesting in part because it seems to somewhat antagonize the negative effects of caffeine on sleep. And it's very safe and it has some small positive effects. It seems to help people who struggle with stress-related sleep issues in particular. So 200 milligrams of L-theanine a day, I've no reservation recommending that to a lot of people. The others, I think glycine is interesting, in part because I think a lot of people don't consume enough of it in general, and it probably has some other positive effects, including on things like blood sugar control, but maybe aging in general. And then I'd argue that tart cherry is actually probably the best demonstrated as a sleep supplement. A lot of the researchers focused on tart cherry concentrate, particular type of cherry called Montmorency cherries, taking 30 mils twice a day. It does seem to help with sleep quality and it seems to help with exercise recovery and be very good for cardiovascular health.
And
So,
that's a sort of rich source of melatonin because melatonin is probably the most sort of known of in this context. What's your view on melatonin supplementation for sleep?
sure. Yeah. So I'm a fan of melatonin when it's used judiciously. I don't think it's used judiciously a lot of the time, though. I think it's most helpful for people with circadian rhythm, sleep wake disorders. But I think that it can be helpful in other contexts too. Obviously, it's very helpful for things like jet lag. The time released form can be helpful for people with sleep maintenance insomnia. There's a form of this called circadian, which at 2 milligrams is used for age-related sleep maintenance insomnia. And then otherwise, I would just say with melatonin, one of the issues is quality control. In some countries, it's not available over the counter or not readily so, and that includes the UK. So I think melatonin is really helpful, and we could easily have multiple podcasts about melatonin by itself, but it's not something that I would recommend willy-nilly. I do, however, think that when it is a good source of melatonin, it's got a remarkably good safety profile. It's not like a lot of hormones where when you take them, you get a negative feedback loop and then your body stops making as much of it itself. There's not really any evidence of that with melatonin. So it's a fascinating molecule. And I think it's helpful for a lot of people, but it needs to be used in an intelligent way. And the specifics of that vary quite a lot between people.
And would you say it's safe up to sort of 10 milligrams or something like that, just from a safety point of view?
I think it probably is, but I don't think that most people need anything like a dose that high. Even 300 micrograms is a pharmacological dose. You'll reach blood levels of melatonin way higher than what you would make just from your body synthesizing melatonin by itself. And so I think a lot of people overdose melatonin, and
Mm.
actually a lower dose would be preferable, especially if someone's taking it in the long term. If we're talking about acute melatonin use, then a lot of the research on jet lag, for example, has people take 5 milligrams. But I actually think that that's probably not optimal either, because the larger the dose, the longer it's in your system. And in the case of jet lag, you're trying to use melatonin to shift your clock, and you actually want something that acts more quickly in that context. You want a sharp pulse of melatonin timed at the right point in your body clock cycle.
Mm. And by the way, in the UK, the Montmorency cherry extracts is called Cherry Active, but there are
Mm.
other versions if you live in the US and so on. So finally, the key point is that we are all different. And there are lots of different approaches. And you've mentioned not just cognitive behavioral therapy, but cognitive stimulant therapy. And you've mentioned important changes in relating to caffeine, less alcohol, and so on. But most importantly, how if somebody wishes to see you or get advice from you on a personal level, how can they do that?
They can either reach out to me directly. So I'm at Greg Potter PhD on LinkedIn, but also on Instagram, or you can reach me via the London Psychiatry Clinic, where I work as a health coach and a sleep specialist. The reality is that if someone struggles with some sort of chronic mental health condition, their sleep is going to be suboptimal too. The two pretty much always go hand in hand. But either of those avenues is fine. I would say it's probably just a little bit faster just to contact me directly.
Well, I'll put those details in the bio for this podcast. And Greg, Dr. Greg Potter, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom about sleep.
Thanks very much, Patrick.